Hello, Steven. Nice to see you again.
Thank you, Guy.
A few days ago, we recorded a little bit of an introduction to your long and successful career, and you gave us good advice. So for those who sees this video the first time, I also recommend to go to that video because you'll learn a lot of things which happened in a very rich career and experience which Steven has had and from which we are benefiting in this discussions. Yeah. And while he was explaining his career, one very important event, which was a kind of a global or a sizable event, was in the time when Steven was at Sony Pictures, and as you know, we shared a common track at the Sony. In November 2014, there was a little incident or a big incident related to an attack which qualified at that time as the biggest corporate attack, I think, in U.S. history. I think that was what Obama was saying at that time, if I get it right. So today we're going to a little bit explore what happened to give you an insight of a real story, and to also draw from that some wisdom and some learnings which hopefully can benefit all of you. So thanks, Steven, for having made the time to join, and looking forward to hear your insights.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Guy. I think it's important to establish some background on what happened, what we did, how we survived. And I think that that's the approach that the listener should take, is one of survival. What would you do if that happened to you? So, first of all, I was at Sony Pictures Entertainment, and my job in 2014 was Executive Vice President for all Global Protection Services. And as Guy knows, that included security, physical security, environment, health, safety, fire life safety, medical services, production security, production safety, and several other things, including investigations on a global basis. We operated in 50 countries, over 50 countries, because we did productions beyond where we had offices. And we had a team of people all over the world. We also did, in the investigations area, we also did computer forensics. So we had 3 labs, one in Hong Kong, one in London, one in LA. And that became very important to us during our cyber breach. So I had teams of people very well trained. The other thing that we did as a team, and involved many others in the functional areas of the organization, was business continuity planning, crisis management, resilience, all of that, preparedness. And I think we did a pretty good job with it, thankfully. So let's go to November 24th, Thanksgiving week, in the United States in 2014, and we had the first indications that we had been breached. And you may say to yourself, well, that was 2014, that's old news. Actually, it's not old news, because the same adversary, using the same malware, using the same tactics, are active today. In this case, though, what made it particularly unique is that the malware was a wiper malware. The intent was to shame, destroy, embarrass, humiliate the company. And what was conveyed was that the adversary, which is nation state, didn't want a particular movie to be released. So in the United States, that became a First Amendment right issue. So what happened that day, that morning, in my office, is one of my staff came in. They'd taken a screenshot of their computer when they turned it on and connected, and it was a Red Devil, and it was called the Guardians of Peace. And what they soon realized is that by being connected, that wiper malware initiated and began to destroy everything on the drive. So imagine a company with thousands and thousands of computers all over the world and people being dependent upon operating digitally, and all of a sudden we've got a problem. So in Los Angeles, I took the security team and I had them make copies, hard copies, and do desktops that said, do not turn on your computer. We also got on the phone and started to notify leadership so that they could in turn notify their teams around the world not to turn on their computers. The message had a demand in it, and it had links for URLs where we thought we might be able to communicate. None of them worked. So there was no ability to communicate, which would indicate there was no real intent to negotiate. So shutting that down that way helped curtail the damage, or minimize, I would say. That doesn't mean we didn't have a lot of damage. What we learned, though, is that, and this came later, they had been in the network about 6 months, and they had exfiltrated a lot of data. How much data, we'll never know. Probably more than they released, and I'll talk about what they released a little bit later. So anyway, because this was a holiday week, a lot of the decision makers were gone. And one of the things I didn't mention is one of the areas of responsibility that I had was InfoSec, or information security. So I had a CISO who reported to me, who happened to be on vacation. Although we connected, we found each other. He had a team of, I think, 35 people at that time around the world as well. So we were in the habit of communicating all the time with our teams, and that was good. We knew each other well. We didn't have a lot of debate over who was going to do what. We had already figured out functionally who was responsible for what. And even beyond that, for the rest of the organization, like finance and HR and legal, they knew what their roles were, communications as well. So that helped. We formed the crisis committee, got it going, and I realized that there were a couple decisions that needed to be made. One in particular for me was we needed help. This was pretty obvious to us. It was a nation state that was responsible, and we just don't have the capability as a private, citizen, if you will, to do certain things that law enforcement does have the ability to do. So thinking about that, which agency would you call? And my strong recommendation to the CEO and General Counsel was that we engage the FBI, because I had been active with the FBI on different programs and associations and memberships and whatever, and I knew the assistant director and a lot of others quite well. And so that relationship and trust that existed before this incident. And that's really critical for the listeners, that you build those relationships ahead of time and you include that in your contingency plans, because you can't have a debate over who to call on the day that happens, because it's really timely. You've got to move quickly. So I was able to get consent or consensus, and I called the assistant director of the FBI in Los Angeles, and I said, I think we need some help. And I told him what happened. And I said, I want to know from you, what is this going to look like? How are we going to work together? And we don't want to read about all this in the paper. We want to just work together and see what we can do to help each other. So I had that commitment. I went back to the senior management, and they said, okay. And so one of the things that happens in companies today, even now, is there's still a debate with the legal department typically over the issue of legal privilege. And and giving up legal privilege by bringing in law enforcement. I can say to this day that no one I know regrets that decision. We worked really well together, and it probably made the difference between whether or not the company survived this or not. That's one of the decisions we made that was really critical,
Can
and
you
it worked.
can you maybe a little bit, as you explained, because it's very important to get the big picture, a little bit give time points. This happened like same day, this happened the day later, this happened a
Yeah,
week later.
yeah.
That gives us a bit
So
a feeling.
that conversation happened within an hour of my realizing that we had a problem. And that afternoon, I had 6 cyber agents from the FBI in my office. And we began to figure out how we're going to have a dialogue, how we're going to communicate. What about confidentiality? What about, I've got people that are very capable forensic investigators. What about the IT people? What about who's got what role, what responsibility? How does this work? So we had to have a lot of conversation about that. They were with us for months, and one of the reasons that I did call the FBI was they had the legal attaché program. So currently today, in about nearly 100 embassies and consulates around the world, you have people that work for the FBI that are legal attachés that have relationships in those countries and cities with the law enforcement community, the local law enforcement community, local, state, and federal in that jurisdiction. And it doesn't mean they had authority to do anything. What it means is they had relationships. And that made a big, big difference in our ability to get things done. So that was day one. Another decision, day one, that morning. This is a big decision, was not really a part of our strategy, but it became one. To unplug worldwide. Because the way you would stop the bleeding is if there's no connectivity, there's nothing that the adversary can do. Even though they had got in and they had removed data, there wasn't anything they could do from a standpoint of destruction.
Beyond that point, yeah.
Yeah. So we made that decision, and we did do that. Day one, worldwide. And now, and the thing that's so important about that is now you've got a company that's very dependent upon its digital ability to move content around the world that cannot do that anymore. So how do you run your business without being connected? So in other words, now your business is pre-internet. Most people I know do not plan to run their business without a digital support mechanism. And so we didn't have that. What we did have, though, in our labs was connectivity, because we didn't identify ourselves as Sony Pictures. So in the investigation side of our shop, people wouldn't know who we were because we were constantly doing investigations. So having the ability to be connected there really helped us later on. But the other thing was, how do you get the message out to not only to all your people around the world, but also to those people that were doing productions for television and theatrical in parts of the world where we weren't set up with anything. And so whether it was your mobile device, your laptop, your CPU, it all would have the same problem. And so when email is down, connectivity doesn't exist. And we had to rethink how we run our business. So the thing I want to be sure to mention here, when you're at a point like this, there's 2 ways to think about it. One is, I need to have the right people in the room to manage the crisis. The other one is, I need to allow senior management and leadership of the company to continue the business. So I believe you have to draw a line. You have to have a distinction between business continuity and crisis response and resilience. And we did. And it actually worked very well. So that the decisions that needed to be made at a more senior level, they were available when we needed that. but otherwise they had confidence that we were doing what we needed to do to manage the crisis day to day. And that did work. And it went on for a long time, because when you unplug, you don't just flip a switch and plug back in and say, okay, we're back, let's go back to work. We found all the malware, let's move on. It doesn't work that way. We had to rebuild everything. And rebuild is not a term that some people like to use, because it implies that what you had was not efficient or not effective. That's not the point. In the end, what's important to know here is this foreign adversary, although they had pretty damn good cyber skills, they got in through phishing. So still today, in major breaches, most breaches, about 85 to 90% still use phishing to get in. And then once they're in, it's amazing what they can do. So what happened with us too is that, remember I said they exfiltrated data. Well, some of it, they did not compromise our email, but there were images of drives that had been taken over time when a new piece of equipment was issued or whatever, and that data, I think, was not encrypted. So they found a way to get access to the email, or archive, I should say, of the top 10 executives in the company, going back up to 12 years. And they started posting this on pastebin sites. And on pastebin, you can't make attribution and you can't remove it. It's just there. So that became a whole other issue for us to deal with. It was really bad press. It could have been worse. I mean, most people, had pretty good behavior in their email, but it was a problem. And then other stories were spawned from all of that data flowing about the entertainment industry and what have you. So we had to also deal with that, in addition to how do we bring back the company? How do we give assurance to our customer base that it's okay to plug back into Sony Pictures? And we had to be confident. We can't just say, oh, it's okay, come on in. We had to be confident that we'd done our jobs and that we had gotten rid of the malware and that it was safe to come back in. That took quite a long time. The other thing that I want to mention, so by bringing in the FBI, an unintended consequence was that our conversations with media and others about what was going on were very limited. It was a criminal investigation. We were not allowed to talk about it. You want to talk about it, call the Department of Justice or the FBI. And the FBI's position was it was a criminal investigation, and they didn't say much. So that was fine with us. And it was the right thing to do. But one of the things that happened is that when the word got out that we brought the FBI in, it immediately became known on a global basis that a federal law enforcement agency is helping us investigate this matter. And so remember I said that it happened, that we found out on November 24th. On December 19th, the President of the United States and the Director of the FBI formally made attribution to North Korea. That's pretty powerful. That had never happened before in a cyber breach against a private sector business. And again, I think that made a difference because I do think that they still had more that they were planning to do that they did not do. So, in looking back, the decisions that I mentioned that we made or had to make, bringing together the functional areas, kind of thinking about who's going to manage the crisis, who's going to run the business, how are you going to run the business, how do you communicate in the dark, all of those decisions, the listeners, my strong encouragement is next week, next month, you bring together all of those functional decision makers in a room at the same time, and you go around the room and you have the conversation about responsibilities, roles, authority, escalation, decision making, and who can do that, especially in the absence of certain decision makers that you otherwise would need. So that is a critical learning from our conversation today. Go back and do that. Have the tough conversations now.
When you mentioned the early days and then the formal announcement in I think December 19th you mentioned, and I guess you had to finally, transition into a certain temporary environment, then finally to the final or rebuilding or reconfiguring or cleaning up and probably building it in a better version later. How long did that take after the
Several weeks. We bought all new equipment and we got rid of the old. We purged them so that the hard drives did not have anything on them, let alone the malware.
so it's like a new machine?
Yeah, so we got new machines. That's what we did. And then we set up the right protocols for how they would be set up. So, we had hundreds and hundreds of applications. But which ones do people really need? I think up to that point, if you said you needed a certain app, we just said, okay, here. And there weren't a lot of controls. So we changed the controls. And it turns out not everybody needed what they said they needed. And this protocol required supervisory approval, and you had to establish why you needed it. We also limited and put some controls in place for internet access, where you could go and where you couldn't go. And then, we had to imagine this. When you're down and then you start to come back, what people are demanding is that their apps be restored right away. So, one senior exec says, I need this right away. Another one says, no, I need this right away. Another one says, no, I need this right away. Well, you can't do them all. So you have to create a pyramid around what's first, second, third, fourth, down to 600, whatever the number is. And if you haven't included something like that in your business impact analysis and your planning, you should. Even though it'll change over time, at least you've got your leadership thinking about what's most important to least important. But then, imagine if you do that in a functional area, in a big department, but now the whole company is down. What that individual thought was number one for him or her might not be number one for the company. And an example I'll give you is we thought that, CCTV cameras, and we had, 2,000-3,000 of them, were really important and they had to come back right away. Well, we didn't bring them back right away. We were able to put security officers in the place of that for a while until we were confident that we could bring the cameras back. But that's just one example. There's hundreds. But that's really important. The other thing, how do you make payroll when you're no longer connected? You can't miss payroll. People need to eat, and they need to be rewarded for their work. And then another one, publicly traded company. We have to account for everything we do every day. And you're going to be audited. How do you do that? Another one, insurance. You've got to track everything you do every moment. So because you're going to, at some point, there'll be an accounting for that. And your insurance carriers are going to come in and they're going to want to see everything. Well, we did account for everything that we did. We had a scribe from my team. That's all he did. He wrote down every decision, every day, every time, the who, what, where, and that made a huge difference later on. And it was all under legal privilege. So as you know, Guy, I can go on, but these are some important learnings.
No, I think what is also impressive, I think the Sony Pictures at that time had how many employees? 6,000, 7,000, maybe something like that?
No, about 12,000.
12,000, so it's a much, much bigger number, which, which couldn't do their work in a normal way. So there was,
Right.
and they're not all in one building, even though there's a bigger campus in Culver City,
50
Los Angeles.
countries.
So email or alternative communication, whether it's phone or other forms of communication, must have been very critical to at least make the best out of that situation and kind of have us continuity going, at least in the early days, and then kind of get to a normal functioning condition again. Plus, I know that Sony Pictures had a lot of thousands or more than tens of thousands of third parties which are working to make
Exactly.
movies happening. So how did you, maybe my last question, because we're running a bit over time, how did you actually manage that?
What's really important in your planning is what I call trees. So, in other words, if let's say I'm the president of international television, and I've got people all over the world. In my hierarchy or my organization, I need to know how to connect not only with my employee base, whether it's through a company device or a personal device, whatever, but also with all of my third-party partners. And so documenting the way that you're going to communicate, not just by email, but by phone as well, is critical. And so some had done a pretty good job with that because we helped them write their crisis plans. Others had not done as good a job, and they did. So they assigned the right people to start, chasing it all down, to find these people, to have the ability to communicate in a different way, to start to think about, again, the continuity of the business. And so that worked. But there's some great tools that are available today through Everbridge and SendWord Now and what have you, that are mass communication tools that you can use for like SMS. And they work really well. And you get the word out quickly. And communication, think about a company our size, as dispersed as it was, you've got to communicate. You can't leave people in the dark. And so that's what we did. We found ways to communicate, including we allowed people to use personal devices. We had to communicate somehow. So, but a lot of people were afraid to use their personal devices that in any way would connect to the workplace because of the malware issue.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure there is a lot of uncertainty of what causes exposure, but at least the structure a little bit independent of the personal devices saved you in some sense, because they were typically structurally not so connected. I know that we have come to the end of this show. I would like to announce also that we will follow up this interesting discussion with a more in-depth view at resilience and some of the learnings. How do we translate that in 2023 in building a resilient company? And so hopefully, that will give you additional insights beyond what already we discussed today. Any final comment from you, Stevan?
Well, I think increasingly today, if you go back to 2014 and look at what happened, but you look at what's happened since then, don't wait until it's your turn to have a breach and then try to figure out what to do. There's a lot of great information out there in the US, CISA and NIST. There's ISO standards. There's plenty of tools that are out there that will help you prepare for and survive. I can't encourage you enough to pay attention to it. And if you're not doing it internally, there's external resources that are available that can help you do that as well. But somebody needs to help you do that and be ready, because not every business survives these attacks.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Stevan. I think it's great that you could share this with us, because you have been there. It's not about reading something about something. It's about trying to relive the whole experience to actually get the right insight and have the right motivation to actually learn from this and be be prepared as well as possible. So thank you so much for today's insights.
Yeah, it was a good conversation. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you.